sometimes the universe has a twisted sense of timing. Just when you think your world has crumbled completely, when you're walking away from everything you've built with nothing but a cardboard box and shattered dreams, fate decides to test just how much you're really worth. This is the story of Sarah Chen, a trauma nurse who thought her career was over at 3:47 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She had no idea that in less than 4 hours, 3 military helicopters would be circling above her apartment building, and the same hospital administration that had just fired her would be begging her to come back. Not for her shift. Not for her regular duties. But, because when disaster strikes and lives hang in the balance, there's only one person they trust to handle what's coming. The woman they just let go. What happens when the system that rejects you suddenly needs you more than anything else in the world? What happens when your expertise becomes the difference between life and death for dozens of people, but you're no longer officially qualified to help? This is that story. A story about pride, redemption, and the moment when being right matters more than being employed. Sarah's final shift was supposed to end her nursing career. Instead, it became the beginning of something no one saw coming. Sarah Chen stared at the cardboard box in her hands, watching raindrops darken the corners where her 15 years of nursing career now sat in crumpled disarray. The weight of the box felt heavier than it should have, filled with nothing more than a coffee mug, a few personal photos, and a small succulent plant that had somehow survived 3 years on the windowsill of the trauma unit break room. The automatic doors of Metropolitan General Hospital slid shut behind her with a gentle whoosh that sounded more final than any goodbye she had ever heard. 3 hours ago, she had been Nurse Sarah Chen, senior trauma specialist, the person doctors called when they needed someone who could start in 4 on a coding patient in the dark during an earthquake. Now she was just Sarah, unemployed and walking through downtown Seattle with her entire professional life tucked under her arm. The rain was typical for November, steady and cold, turning the city streets into mirrors that reflected the gray sky above. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter and kept walking, not really knowing where she was going. Her apartment was only 6 blocks away, but she wasn't ready to face the silence that waited there. For 15 years, her identity had been wrapped up in those hospital corridors, in the controlled chaos of the emergency department, in the adrenaline rush of saving lives when minutes and seconds were all that stood between living and dying. The final meeting with hospital administration had lasted exactly 12 minutes. Sarah knew because she had stared at the clock on the wall behind Dr. Morrison's head, watching the second hand tick away what remained of her career. The charges were serious, they said. Insubordination. Failure to follow protocol. Endangering patients' safety. The words had felt surreal, like hearing someone describe a person she didn't recognize. It had all started 3 weeks ago with Marcus Williams, a 17-year-old kid who came into the emergency department after a motorcycle accident. Multiple trauma, internal bleeding, the kind of case Sarah had seen hundreds of times before. But something had been different that night. Dr. Peterson, the attending physician, had ordered a specific course of treatment that Sarah knew, with every fiber of her professional experience, was wrong. The protocol called for immediate surgery to address what appeared to be internal bleeding in the abdomen. Standard procedure, textbook medicine. But Sarah had noticed something in the boy's symptoms that didn't fit the neat pattern everyone else was seeing. His pain presentation was wrong. The location was off. His vital signs told a story that didn't match the obvious narrative. She had tried to discuss her concerns with Dr. Peterson quietly, professionally, the way she had done countless times before with other doctors over the years. But Peterson was new to Metropolitan General, fresh from a prestigious residency program, and he wasn't interested in input from nursing staff. Especially not input that questioned his diagnostic skills. Sarah had pushed harder. She had requested additional tests, suggested alternative diagnoses, even went so far as to contact Dr. Martinez, the chief of surgery, to get a second opinion. In the end, she had been right. Marcus Williams hadn't been bleeding internally at all. He had been suffering from a rare condition that mimicked the symptoms of abdominal trauma, and the surgery Dr. Peterson had ordered would have killed him. The boy had lived. Marcus Williams went home to his family 2 days later, healthy and whole, because Sarah Chen had refused to follow protocol when protocol was wrong. But hospital administration saw only one thing: a nurse who had challenged a doctor's authority, who had gone over his head, who had disrupted the chain of command that kept the emergency department functioning smoothly. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah as she walked through the rain. She had saved a life, and it had cost her everything. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she fumbled to answer it while balancing the box. Her sister's voice was warm and concerned, the way it had been for the past 3 weeks as Sarah had fought the administration's decision through every appeal process available. "How did it go?" Lisa asked, though Sarah could hear in her voice that she already knew the answer. "It went exactly like we expected it to go," Sarah replied, stepping under the awning of a coffee shop to escape the rain for a moment. "I'm officially unemployed as of 4 o'clock today." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Sarah could picture Lisa sitting in her own office across town, probably staring out her window at the same gray sky, trying to find the right words to offer comfort. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I know how much this meant to you." Sarah shifted the box to her other arm and watched people hurry past on the sidewalk, all of them moving with purpose toward destinations that mattered, jobs that were waiting for them, lives that made sense. "The worst part is that I'd do it again," she said. "If I walked into that emergency room right now and saw the same situation, I'd make the same choice. That kid is alive because someone was willing to speak up when things didn't look right." "Maybe that's not the worst part," Lisa said quietly. "Maybe that's the best part." After hanging up, Sarah stood under the awning for another few minutes, watching the rain and thinking about what came next. At 38 years old, starting over felt like climbing a mountain with no clear path to the top. She had enough savings to last maybe 3 months if she was careful. Her nursing license was still valid, but word traveled fast in the medical community, especially when it came to nurses who had been terminated for challenging doctors. The walk to her apartment took her past 3 other hospitals, all places where she had worked at various points in her career, all places where she knew people who might be able to help her find something new. But Sarah also knew how these things worked. Hospital administrators talked to each other. Her name would already be circulating through the informal networks that determined who was hireable and who wasn't. By the time she reached her building, a converted warehouse in the Capitol Hill neighborhood that had been turned into loft apartments, Sarah's jacket was soaked through and her hands were numb from carrying the box. The elevator was broken again, which meant climbing 4 flights of stairs while trying not to drop the remnants of her professional life. Her apartment felt smaller than usual when she finally got inside, as if the walls had moved closer together while she was gone. She set the box down on her kitchen counter and looked around at the space she had called home for the past 5 years. It was nice enough, with exposed brick walls and large windows that normally filled the place with light. But today, with the gray sky pressing against the glass, everything looked muted and dim. Sarah made coffee and sat down at her small dining table with her laptop, opening job search websites with the grim determination of someone who knew the odds were stacked against her. The nursing shortage that had dominated healthcare headlines for years meant there were plenty of positions available, but most of them required references from previous supervisors, background checks that would reveal the circumstances of her termination, and explanations she wasn't sure how to give. She was halfway through filling out an application for a position at a clinic in Tacoma when her phone rang again. The number wasn't familiar, but something made her answer it anyway. "Is this Sarah Chen?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, with an authority that Sarah recognized immediately as military. "Yes, this is Sarah. Miss Chen, this is Colonel Rebecca Martinez with the Washington National Guard. I need to ask if you're available for emergency deployment." Sarah nearly dropped her phone. "I'm sorry, what?" "We have a situation developing, and we need experienced trauma nurses immediately. Your name came up in our database as someone with extensive emergency medicine experience and disaster response training." The disaster response training had been something Sarah had completed years ago, back when she had been idealistic enough to think she might join Doctors Without Borders someday. She had never actually been deployed, and she had almost forgotten the certification existed. "Colonel Martinez, I think there might be some mistake. I'm not currently employed by any hospital, and I'm Miss Chen. I'm going to stop you right there. Are you physically capable of reporting for duty within the next 2 hours? Because if you are, the employment details can be worked out later." Sarah looked out her window at the rain, then at her laptop screen showing the half-completed job application, then at the cardboard box sitting on her counter. What kind of situation are we talking about? The kind where people are going to die if we don't get qualified medical personnel on scene immediately. I can give you more details when you get here, but I need to know right now if you're in or out. There was something in the colonel's voice that reminded Sarah of why she had become a nurse in the first place. Not for the steady paycheck or the job security, but for moments when skills and experience and the willingness to act quickly could mean the difference between life and death for another human being. Where do you need me to be? Sarah asked. McCord Air Force Base, Building 4120. Ask for Colonel Martinez when you get to the main gate. And, Ms. Chen? Bring whatever emergency medical supplies you might have at home. We're working with limited resources. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her quiet apartment for exactly 30 seconds, letting the weight of what had just happened settle over her. Then, she moved into action with the same focused efficiency that had made her one of the most respected trauma nurses on the West Coast. She changed into scrubs, packed a bag with clothes and personal items, and gathered the emergency medical kit she kept in her closet for camping trips and natural disasters. It wasn't much, basic first aid supplies and some medications, but it was better than nothing. As she was about to leave, Sarah looked back at the cardboard box on her counter. Inside it were the remnants of a career that had defined her for 15 years, a professional identity that had been stripped away because she had dared to put patient care above institutional politics. But maybe, she thought as she grabbed her keys and headed for the door, maybe that identity wasn't really gone. Maybe it had just been waiting for the right moment to prove what it was really worth. The drive to McCord Air Force Base took 45 minutes through traffic that seemed unusually heavy for a Tuesday evening. Sarah spent most of the drive trying to imagine what kind of emergency would require calling in civilian nurses with disaster response training, but nothing she could think of felt quite right. Natural disasters were handled through different channels. Terrorist attacks would involve FBI and federal agencies. Whatever this was, it was something unusual enough to require pulling nurses from outside normal military medical channels. The rain had stopped by the time she reached the base, but the sky was still dark and threatening. Security at the main gate was tighter than usual, with armed guards checking IDs and asking detailed questions about the nature of each visitor's business. When Sarah mentioned Colonel Martinez, the guards made several phone calls before finally waving her through with directions to Building 4120. The building turned out to be a large, nondescript structure that looked like it could have been used for anything from vehicle maintenance to equipment storage. But, as Sarah approached the main entrance, she could see the unmistakable signs of a rapidly assembled command center. Military vehicles were parked in precise rows, personnel moved with the focused urgency that indicated something significant was happening, and temporary communication equipment had been set up in what looked like a hastily constructed outdoor staging area. Colonel Martinez turned out to be a woman in her early 50s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that suggested she had seen enough genuine emergencies to know the difference between panic and controlled response. She was waiting just inside the entrance to Building 4120, checking items off a list on a clipboard while simultaneously coordinating with 3 different people via radio and cell phone. "Miss Chen," she said, looking up as Sarah approached. "Thank you for coming. I know this is highly unusual, but we're dealing with a situation that requires expertise we don't have immediate access to through normal military medical channels." Sarah followed Colonel Martinez deeper into the building, past offices that had been quickly converted into planning centers and staging areas. Maps covered most of the wall space, marked with symbols and notations that Sarah didn't recognize but that clearly meant something important to the people studying them. "What exactly are we dealing with?" Sarah asked. Colonel Martinez stopped walking and turned to face Sarah directly. 47 minutes ago, a commercial airliner experienced catastrophic mechanical failure approximately 60 miles northeast of Seattle. The pilot managed to bring the aircraft down in a remote area near Mount Rainier, but we have confirmed survivors in terrain that makes conventional rescue operations extremely difficult. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "How many passengers?" 136 souls on board. "We have radio contact with some survivors, but the aircraft broke apart on impact and passengers are scattered across approximately half a mile of heavily forested terrain. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, and we have perhaps 3 hours of daylight left before rescue operations become nearly impossible. They had reached what appeared to be the main command center, a large room filled with communication equipment, multiple screens showing weather data and terrain maps, and military personnel coordinating what was obviously a complex rescue operation. The problem, Colonel Martinez continued, is that most of our military medical personnel are deployed overseas, and the civilian medical teams that would normally handle this kind of emergency are already committed to a multi-vehicle accident on I-5 that happened earlier today. We need experienced trauma nurses who can be inserted directly into the crash site to provide immediate medical care while we work to extract survivors. Sarah looked at the maps on the walls, noting the elevation markers and terrain features that would make any rescue operation challenging. Inserted how? Colonel Martinez pointed to a window that overlooked the tarmac outside. 3 military helicopters sat waiting, their rotors slowly turning, ground crews making final preparations for departure. Those helicopters will take you and 2 other medical personnel directly to the crash site. Your job will be to establish a field triage center, provide emergency medical care to survivors, and help coordinate medical evacuations for the most critical cases. It was the kind of situation Sarah had trained for but never actually experienced, the kind of emergency where every decision mattered and there was no time for second-guessing or committee consultations. It was also exactly the kind of challenge that had drawn her to emergency medicine in the first place, before hospital politics and administrative bureaucracy had made her question whether she was really making a difference. What about medical supplies? Sarah asked. Each helicopter is loaded with emergency medical equipment, trauma supplies, and medications. You'll also be working with Dr. James Rodriguez, a flight surgeon with extensive wilderness medicine experience, and Alex Thompson, a paramedic who has done disaster response in 5 different countries. Sarah nodded, already mentally preparing for what lay ahead. When do we leave? In 15 minutes. The other team members are already suiting up. Colonel Martinez handed Sarah a military-style jacket and equipment harness. One more thing, Ms. Chun. I know about what happened at Metropolitan General. I know why you're not currently working at a hospital. Sarah tensed, waiting for the conversation to take a turn she had been dreading. What I want you to know, Colonel Martinez continued, is that the reason your name came up in our database had nothing to do with your recent employment status. It came up because 3 years ago, you completed disaster response training with a perfect score and received commendations for your clinical skills and decision-making under pressure. Right now, we don't care about hospital politics or administrative procedures. We care about whether you can save lives in a situation where the normal rules don't apply. 20 minutes later, Sarah was strapped into the cargo area of a military helicopter, watching the lights of Seattle fade away below as they flew north toward Mount Rainier. The 2 men sitting across from her, Dr. Rodriguez and Alex Thompson, were checking equipment and reviewing the limited information they had about the crash site. The helicopter was loud, vibrating with the steady rhythm of the rotors, and Sarah found herself thinking about how drastically her life had changed in the space of a few hours. This morning, she had been fighting to save a career that felt like it was slipping away despite her best efforts. Tonight, she was flying toward a disaster zone where her skills might be the difference between life and death for more than 100 people. As they flew over the foothills leading up to Mount Rainier, Sarah could see the first signs of the crash site in the distance. Smoke was still rising from several locations in the forest, and, even from the air, she could see the distinctive scattered pattern of debris that indicated a severe aircraft breakup. Dr. Rodriguez leaned over to speak into her ear over the noise of the helicopter. Fair warning, this is going to be unlike anything any of us has seen before. The terrain is rough, visibility is poor, and we're going to be working in conditions that are far from ideal. But these people need help, and we're the only help they're going to get for the next several hours. Sarah nodded and checked her medical kit one more time, making sure everything was properly secured and easily accessible. In less than 10 minutes, they would be on the ground, and everything she had learned in 15 years of trauma nursing would be put to a test unlike any she had ever faced. Looking down at the mountainous terrain below, Sarah realized that losing her job at Metropolitan General might have been the best thing that had ever happened to her. Not because she was glad to be unemployed, but because it had led her to exactly where she needed to be at exactly the moment when her skills were needed most. The helicopter began its descent toward the crash site, and Sarah Chen, the nurse who had been let go during her final shift, prepared to begin the most important work of her career. The first thing that hit Sarah when the helicopter door opened was the smell. Jet fuel mixed with smoke, burned metal, and something else she recognized but didn't want to think about too carefully. The second thing was the sound, or rather the absence of it. Despite the chaos she could see spread across the mountainside below, an eerie quiet hung over the crash site that was broken only by the distant calls of survivors and the occasional crack of settling debris. Dr. Rodriguez jumped down first, immediately beginning to survey the scene while Alex Thompson started unloading medical supplies. Sarah followed, her feet landing on uneven ground covered with pine needles, small pieces of aircraft debris, and patches of mud from the earlier rain. The main body of the aircraft had come to rest about 200 yards ahead, tilted at an angle against a cluster of large pine trees. Even in the fading daylight, Sarah could see that the impact had been devastating. The fuselage had cracked open in several places, and sections of the plane were scattered across the mountainside like pieces of a broken toy. But what struck Sarah most was how many people were moving around the wreckage. Passengers who had survived the initial impact were helping other survivors, creating makeshift shelters, and trying to organize some kind of basic first aid with whatever resources they could find. It was remarkable and heartbreaking at the same time. "Command, this is Ground Team Alpha," Dr. Rodriguez spoke into his radio. "We are on site and beginning assessment. Initial visual count shows approximately 40 to 50 survivors in various conditions. We'll update as we establish triage." Alex Thompson had already started walking toward a group of passengers who appeared to be gathered around someone lying on the ground. Sarah grabbed her medical kit and followed, stepping carefully over debris and trying to get a sense of the overall situation. The first patient was a middle-aged woman who was conscious but clearly in significant pain. Her left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and she was pale with shock. A man who appeared to be her husband was kneeling beside her, holding her hand and trying to keep her calm. "I'm Sarah, I'm a nurse," Sarah said, kneeling down beside them. "What's your name?" "Janet Morrison," the woman replied through gritted teeth. "And this is my husband Paul. Is my leg broken?" Sarah did a quick visual assessment while pulling supplies from her kit. The leg was definitely fractured, probably in multiple places, but there didn't appear to be any arterial bleeding or signs that the bone had punctured major blood vessels. "Yes, your leg is broken, but we're going to take care of you," Sarah said, beginning to stabilize the fracture with an inflatable splint from her kit. "Have you lost consciousness at any point since the crash?" "No, I don't think so. Everything happened so fast. One minute we were drinking coffee and talking about our vacation, and the next minute the plane was shaking and everyone was screaming." While Sarah worked on Janet's leg, she could hear Dr. Rodriguez and Alex Thompson moving through the crash site, calling out medical assessments and beginning the process of triage that would determine which survivors needed immediate evacuation and which could wait for ground-based rescue teams. "Paul," Sarah said to Janet's husband, "I need you to stay with Janet and keep her talking. Don't let her fall asleep, and call for me immediately if she starts vomiting or seems confused." "Can you do that?" Paul nodded, and Sarah could see in his eyes the same mix of fear and determination she had seen in family members countless times before. People rose to challenges they never imagined they would face when someone they loved was in danger. Sarah moved on to the next group of survivors, where she found a teenage girl sitting beside an older man who was unconscious. The girl's face was streaked with dirt and tears, and she looked up at Sarah with an expression of desperate hope. "Please help him," the girl said. "This is my grandfather. He hasn't woken up since we crashed, and I don't know what to do." Sarah knelt beside the man and immediately began checking his vital signs. His pulse was weak but steady, his breathing was shallow, and there was a significant bump on the side of his head that indicated a probable concussion or worse. More concerning was the fact that his pupils were uneven, which suggested increased intracranial pressure from brain swelling. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Sarah asked while continuing her assessment. "Emma. Emma Rodriguez." Is my grandfather going to be okay? Sarah looked at the girl's face and saw herself at 17, filled with absolute trust that adults would somehow be able to fix anything that went wrong. It was a trust that Sarah had spent 15 years trying to live up to, and it was exactly the kind of trust that had gotten her fired from Metropolitan General for refusing to follow orders that would have endangered a patient. Emma, your grandfather has a head injury, and he needs to be evacuated to a hospital as soon as possible. I'm going to radio for a medical helicopter to come get him, but I need you to help me monitor him until they arrive. Sarah showed Emma how to check her grandfather's pulse and breathing, giving her specific things to watch for and clear instructions about when to call for help. Keeping family members involved in patient care wasn't just good medicine, it was good psychology. People needed to feel like they were doing something useful, especially in situations where they felt completely powerless. As Sarah moved through the crash site over the next hour, a pattern began to emerge that was both encouraging and troubling. The encouraging part was that most of the survivors had injuries that were serious but not immediately life-threatening. Broken bones, lacerations, burns, and concussions, but fewer internal injuries and arterial bleeds than she might have expected from such a severe crash. The troubling part was what she wasn't seeing. Based on the size of the aircraft and the passenger manifest that Dr. Rodriguez had received via radio, there should have been nearly 140 people on board. Sarah had accounted for perhaps 60 survivors, which left a significant number of people unaccounted for. Rodriguez, she called out to the flight surgeon, who was working on a patient with severe burns about 50 yards away. We need to expand the search area. There are too many people missing. Dr. Rodriguez looked up from his patient and nodded grimly. I've been thinking the same thing. The impact pattern suggests the aircraft broke apart before it hit the ground. There could be survivors scattered over a much wider area than we initially thought. Alex Thompson joined them, his medical kit now significantly lighter after treating nearly a dozen patients. I've been talking to some of the passengers who were awake during the crash, he said. They're saying the plane broke into at least 3 major sections. The tail section separated first, somewhere over that ridge to the east. Sarah looked in the direction Alex was pointing and felt her stomach drop. The terrain in that direction was even more rugged than where they currently were, with steep slopes and dense forest that would make finding survivors extremely difficult, especially in the gathering darkness. We need additional teams, Sarah said. And we need them now, while there's still enough light to conduct search operations. Dr. Rodriguez was already on his radio, communicating with the command center back at McCord Air Force Base. Sarah could hear only half of the conversation, but the parts she could hear weren't encouraging. Weather conditions were deteriorating faster than expected, and the additional medical teams that had been promised were still dealing with the multi-vehicle accident on I-5. They're sending 2 more helicopters with search and rescue personnel, Dr. Rodriguez reported after finishing his radio call. But they won't be here for at least 90 minutes, and they're recommending that we prepare to suspend search operations at nightfall due to weather concerns. Sarah looked around at the survivors they had already found and treated. Most of them were stable enough to wait for ground-based evacuation teams that would arrive sometime during the night. But if there were 30 or 40 people still missing somewhere in the wilderness, waiting until morning might mean waiting too long. I'm going to scout the area to the east, Sarah announced. If there are survivors over that ridge, we need to find them before it gets completely dark. Dr. Rodriguez looked at her with the expression of someone who was about to object on safety grounds, then seemed to reconsider. Take a radio and check in every 15 minutes. If you're not back in 2 hours, we're sending the search teams after you. Sarah packed a smaller medical kit with essential supplies and started hiking toward the ridge Alex had pointed out. The terrain was more difficult than it had looked from a distance, with fallen logs, steep slopes, and thick underbrush that made progress slow and exhausting. But, as she climbed higher, Sarah began to hear something that made her push forward despite the difficult conditions. Voices. Faint and distant, but definitely human voices calling for help. The tail section of the aircraft had come to rest in a small clearing about half a mile from the main crash site, hidden from view by the ridge and a thick stand of pine trees. Unlike the main fuselage, which had remained largely intact despite breaking open, the tail section had been completely destroyed on impact. Debris was scattered over a wide area, and Sarah could see immediately that the survivors here had faced much more severe conditions than those at the main site. There were 14 people in the clearing, and, unlike the relatively organized group Sarah had left behind, these survivors were in various states of shock and confusion. Several had severe injuries that required immediate attention, and it was clear that they had been trying to help each other with minimal supplies and no medical training. "I'm Sarah, I'm a nurse," she called out as she approached the group. "I'm here to help." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Several people started talking at once, pointing toward different patients, describing injuries and symptoms with the kind of desperate urgency that Sarah recognized from family members in hospital emergency rooms. Sarah quickly identified the most critical patients and began the same triage process she had used at the main site. But the injuries here were more severe, and several patients clearly needed evacuation immediately rather than later. A man in his 30s with multiple lacerations and what appeared to be internal injuries was unconscious and showing signs of shock. A woman in her 50s had a compound fracture of her arm that was bleeding heavily despite the crude bandages someone had fashioned from torn clothing. A young boy, probably 8 or 9 years old, was conscious but having difficulty breathing, suggesting possible chest injuries. Sarah radioed back to Dr. Rodriguez, describing the situation and requesting immediate medical evacuation for the most critical patients. The response was not what she wanted to hear. "The evacuation helicopters are grounded due to deteriorating weather conditions," came the reply. "We've got fog moving in faster than expected, and visibility is dropping below safe flying minimums. They're saying it might be morning before they can resume medical evacuations." Sarah looked at the unconscious man and knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't survive until morning without surgical intervention. The woman with the compound fracture was losing blood steadily, and the young boy's breathing was getting more labored by the minute. "Rodriguez, that's not acceptable," Sarah replied. "I have at least 3 patients here who need immediate evacuation or they're not going to make it through the night." There was silence on the radio for several minutes, and Sarah could imagine the discussion that was probably taking place at the command center. Military personnel talking about acceptable risk levels and safety protocols while she stood in a clearing full of people who needed help that might not come. When Dr. Rodriguez finally came back on the radio, his voice carried a tone that Sarah hadn't heard before. "Sarah, I'm going to ask you to do something that's completely outside normal protocols. Are you willing to perform emergency surgery in a field environment with minimal equipment?" Sarah looked at the unconscious man, whose breathing was becoming more shallow by the minute. She thought about Marcus Williams, the 17-year-old motorcycle accident victim who had lived because she had been willing to challenge medical authority when protocol was wrong. She thought about hospital administrators and their concern for liability and proper procedures. Then, she thought about the Hippocratic Oath and the promise she had made 15 years ago to do no harm, which sometimes meant taking action even when the action carried risks. "Walk me through what you need me to do," Sarah replied. For the next 3 hours, working by the light of flashlights and emergency flares, Sarah performed emergency surgery on a mountainside under conditions that would have been considered impossible in any normal medical setting. Guided by Dr. Rodriguez's voice on the radio and, drawing on every bit of training and experience she had accumulated over 15 years, she repaired internal bleeding, stabilized fractures, and managed trauma cases that would have challenged a fully equipped hospital emergency room. The woman with the compound fracture required emergency amputation of her arm to prevent death from blood loss. Sarah had never performed an amputation outside of a hospital setting, but, with Dr. Rodriguez talking her through the procedure step by step and Alex Thompson coordinating from the main site, she was able to complete the surgery successfully. The young boy with breathing difficulties had a collapsed lung that required immediate chest tube insertion. Using improvised equipment and sterile techniques that stretched the definition of sterile beyond any reasonable limit, Sarah was able to re-inflate his lung and stabilize his condition. The unconscious man required emergency surgery to repair internal bleeding that would have killed him within hours. Working with a knife sterilized over an open flame and using torn clothing for bandages, Sarah opened his abdomen, identified the source of bleeding, and managed to stop it using techniques she had learned in trauma surgery rotations but never imagined using outside of a proper operating room. By the time the first ground-based rescue teams reached the clearing at 2 in the morning, Sarah had successfully treated 14 patients, performed 3 emergency surgeries, and coordinated the evacuation of the most critical cases using improvised stretchers and volunteer carriers from among the less injured survivors. Every patient was alive. More than that, every patient was stable enough to survive transport to proper medical facilities where they could receive the advanced care they needed for full recovery. As Sarah finally sat down for the first time in nearly 8 hours, her hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline, she realized that something fundamental had changed. Not just in her circumstances, but in how she understood her own capabilities and what she was really meant to do with her medical training. The nurse who had been fired for insubordination had just saved more lives in a single night than she had saved in some entire months working in a traditional hospital setting. And she had done it by trusting her own judgment, making decisions under pressure, and refusing to let bureaucratic procedures get in the way of patient care. Dr. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio one final time as the last of the critical patients were being loaded onto evacuation vehicles. "Sarah, I don't know what your plans are for the future, but I want you to know that what you accomplished tonight was extraordinary. You saved lives that would have been lost, and you did it under conditions that most medical professionals couldn't handle." Sarah looked around the clearing, now empty except for debris and the medical supplies they had used throughout the night. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear helicopters approaching to evacuate the final group of survivors from the main crash site. In less than 12 hours, she had gone from unemployed nurse to disaster response specialist. But, more importantly, she had rediscovered why she had become a nurse in the first place, and she had proven to herself that patient care would always be more important than institutional politics. The sun was beginning to rise over Mount Rainier, painting the mountainside in shades of gold and orange that made the previous night feel like something from another world. Sarah packed up her medical kit, now nearly empty after treating more trauma cases in 8 hours than she typically saw in a month, and began the hike back to the main crash site where evacuation helicopters were waiting to take her back to civilization. But, as she walked through the forest, Sarah realized that she wasn't the same person who had climbed this mountain the night before. The nurse who had lost her job for challenging authority had become someone who trusted her own judgment completely, someone who knew that the most important medical decisions often had to be made outside the comfort zone of established protocols and procedures. By the time the helicopter lifted off from the crash site, carrying Sarah back toward Seattle, she already knew that her career was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The helicopter touched down at McCord Air Force Base just as the morning news crews were arriving to cover what was already being called one of the most successful civilian aircraft disaster rescues in Pacific Northwest history. Sarah could see the reporters setting up their equipment near the base entrance as she gathered her medical kit and prepared to disembark. She had not slept in nearly 24 hours, her scrubs were stained with blood and dirt, and her hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline that had carried her through the night. But, as she stepped off the helicopter, Sarah felt more energized and focused than she had in months. Colonel Martinez was waiting on the tarmac with several other military officials and what appeared to be medical personnel from multiple hospitals. As Sarah approached the group, she noticed that one of the civilian doctors looked familiar. It took her a moment to place him, and, when she did, her stomach tightened with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Dr. Morrison, the hospital administrator who had terminated her employment less than 18 hours ago, was standing beside Colonel Martinez, looking distinctly uncomfortable in his expensive suit among all the military uniforms. "Miss Chen," Colonel Martinez said as Sarah joined the group, "I want you to meet Dr. Harrison from Seattle Children's Hospital and Dr. Kim from University of Washington Medical Center. They've been coordinating the medical care for the survivors you helped rescue." Sarah shook hands with both doctors, noting that Dr. Morrison seemed to be trying to avoid eye contact. Dr. Harrison, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, stepped forward first. "Miss Chen, I've been working in pediatric trauma for 25 years, and I have never seen field medicine performed at the level of what you accomplished last night." "The young boy with the collapsed lung? His parents wanted me to specifically thank the nurse who saved his life. According to the paramedics who transported him, the chest tube insertion you performed was textbook perfect, despite being done in complete darkness with improvised equipment." Dr. Kim nodded in agreement. The man with internal bleeding arrived at our trauma center in stable condition because of the surgery you performed. Our surgical team reviewed your field notes, and they were amazed that you were able to identify and repair the specific arterial damage without advanced imaging or proper surgical instruments. What you did was nothing short of miraculous. Sarah felt a flush of professional pride, the kind of recognition she had craved throughout her career but had rarely received in the bureaucratic environment of hospital administration. But she also felt a growing curiosity about why Dr. Morrison was present for this conversation.
"Thank you," Sarah replied. "But I was just doing what needed to be done."
Dr. Rodriguez guided me through most of the procedures via radio, and Alex Thompson coordinated supplies and logistics. It was definitely a team effort. Colonel Martinez smiled.
"Ms. Chen, you're being modest."
Dr. Rodriguez told me that you made critical decisions independently that saved lives, and that you performed under pressure in ways that exceeded his expectations for even experienced military medical personnel.
Dr.
Morrison finally stepped forward, and Sarah could see in his expression the kind of discomfort that came from having to admit a significant mistake in judgment.
"Ms. Chen, I owe you an apology. And, more than that, I need to ask you a question." Sarah waited, genuinely curious about what Dr. Morrison might have to say.
Yesterday, when we terminated your employment at Metropolitan General, we made that decision based on what we believed were concerns about your ability to follow hospital protocols and work within established chains of command. But, after seeing the reports from last night's rescue operation, and after speaking with Colonel Martinez about your performance under extreme conditions, I'm beginning to think that we may have fundamentally misunderstood what kind of nurse you are and what kind of medical environment you're best suited for.
Sarah felt a surge of anger mixed with vindication.
Dr. Morrison, with all due respect, my ability to work within established chains of command was never the issue. The issue was whether I was willing to follow orders that I believed would endanger patient safety. And I think last night demonstrated pretty clearly what my priorities are when it comes to patient care. Dr. Morrison nodded, looking even more uncomfortable.
"You're absolutely right. And that's why I'm here."
Metropolitan General would like to offer you your job back, with a promotion to senior trauma supervisor and a significant increase in salary. The offer hung in the air like something unexpected and slightly surreal. 3 days ago, Sarah would have jumped at the chance to return to Metropolitan General with increased responsibility and recognition. But, standing on a military airbase at 7 in the morning, still covered in the evidence of the most meaningful medical work she had ever done, the offer felt like something from a previous lifetime. "Dr. Morrison, I appreciate the gesture, but I don't think that's going to work," Sarah replied. "The fundamental problems that led to my termination haven't changed. You're offering me my old job back because of what I accomplished when I was working outside your system, not within it. And I think that tells us everything we need to know about whether your system is the right place for someone with my approach to patient care." Dr. Harrison and Dr. Kim exchanged glances, and Sarah could see something passing between them that suggested they had been expecting this conversation to take exactly this turn.
"Ms. Chen," Dr. Harrison said, "what if we told you that there might be other options? Positions where your particular combination of clinical skills and independent judgment would be seen as assets rather than liabilities?" Before Sarah could respond, Colonel Martinez stepped forward. "Ms. Chen, I need to add something to this conversation. Based on your performance last night, the Washington National Guard would like to offer you a commission as a captain in our Medical Reserve Unit.
It would involve monthly training and deployment for emergency situations like last night, but it would also come with opportunities for additional training in wilderness medicine, disaster response, and field surgery techniques." Sarah looked around at the group of medical professionals and military officials, all of whom seemed to be waiting for her response to job offers that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours ago. But what struck her most was how different this conversation felt from every other career discussion she had ever had. Instead of talking about hospital politics and administrative procedures, they were talking about patient care and clinical skills. Instead of questioning her judgment, they were praising her ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. Instead of treating her independent thinking as a liability, they were recognizing it as exactly the kind of asset that emergency medicine required. Colonel Martinez, I'm definitely interested in the National Guard position.
Dr. Harrison, I'd like to hear more about what other options you mentioned. Dr. Harrison smiled. Seattle Children's Hospital has been developing a pediatric emergency transport program that would provide advanced medical care for critically injured children during transport from remote areas to our trauma center. We need nurses with extensive emergency medicine experience who can work independently and make critical decisions without direct physician supervision. Based on what you accomplished last night, you would be perfect for that kind of work. Dr. Kim nodded.
University of Washington Medical Center has a similar program focused on adult trauma, and we're also developing a training program for nurses who want to specialize in disaster medicine and emergency field surgery. You could potentially work with both programs, splitting your time between direct patient care and training other medical personnel for emergency situations. Sarah felt something that had been tight in her chest for weeks finally beginning to relax. These were not conversations about fitting into existing systems or following established protocols. These were conversations about creating new approaches to emergency medicine that prioritized patient care and clinical expertise over administrative convenience. I'm interested in all of those opportunities, Sarah said.
But I want to be clear about something. What happened at Metropolitan General wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment on my part. I will always prioritize patient safety over institutional politics, and I will always speak up when I think established procedures are putting patients at risk. If that's going to be a problem, then we should discuss it now rather than later. Colonel Martinez laughed. Ms. Chen, that attitude is exactly why we want you in our medical unit.
Military medicine is all about adapting to situations that don't fit standard protocols and making decisions when you can't wait for permission from higher authority.
We need medical personnel who can think independently and act decisively when lives are at stake.
Dr. Harrison nodded in agreement.
Emergency pediatric transport is similar.
When you're in an ambulance or helicopter with a critically injured child, you don't have the luxury of committee consultations or administrative oversight. You have to trust your training, trust your experience, and make the best decisions you can with the information and resources available. Dr. Morrison, who had been listening to this conversation with an expression of growing understanding, finally spoke up again.
Ms. Chen, I think I'm beginning to see why our traditional hospital environment wasn't the right fit for your skills.
And I want you to know that we're going to be reviewing our protocols and procedures to make sure we don't lose other qualified medical personnel because we're too focused on administrative concerns instead of patient care. Sarah appreciated the acknowledgement, but she also knew that institutional change was difficult and slow, and that she was better suited for medical environments that already recognized the value of independent clinical judgment. The next few hours passed in a blur of meetings, paperwork, and phone calls as Sarah began the process of accepting multiple positions that would completely transform her career. The National Guard Commission would require a physical fitness test and several weeks of military medical training. The pediatric transport position would involve certification in advanced life support techniques and wilderness medicine. The disaster medicine training program would mean traveling to conferences and working with emergency responders from around the country. It was exactly the kind of complex, challenging, and meaningful work that Sarah had dreamed about when she first decided to become a nurse. By noon, she was finally ready to leave the base and return to her apartment. But, as she was gathering her things, Alex Thompson, the paramedic who had worked with her during the rescue operation, approached with a proposition that surprised her even more than all the job offers. Sarah, I know you've got a lot of new opportunities to think about, but I wanted to run something by you. I've been working in emergency medicine for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished last night. It got me thinking about whether there might be a way to create a specialized emergency response team that could be deployed to situations like aircraft crashes, natural disasters, and other emergencies where traditional emergency medical services aren't equipped to handle the complexity of the medical needs.
Sarah looked at Alex with growing interest. What kind of team are you talking about?
A small group of highly trained medical personnel who could be deployed rapidly to disaster sites to provide advanced medical care in field conditions. Think of it as a civilian version of military field medicine, but focused specifically on emergency situations where people need immediate medical attention in remote or dangerous locations. Alex pulled out a notebook and showed Sarah some rough sketches and ideas he had been working on. "I've been talking to Dr. Rodriguez about it, and he thinks it's a viable concept. There are plenty of situations where people need emergency medical care but can't wait for traditional ambulance transport or helicopter evacuation. Hiking accidents in remote areas, natural disasters that cut off access to hospitals, industrial accidents in isolated locations. Right now, those people either get basic first aid or they die waiting for help to arrive." Sarah studied Alex's notes, feeling the same excitement she had felt when she first learned about emergency medicine. This was the kind of innovative thinking that emergency medical care needed, the kind of approach that prioritized getting advanced medical treatment to patients wherever they were rather than trying to get patients to medical treatment facilities. How would something like that work? Who would fund it? How would you get authorization to provide medical care outside of traditional hospital settings? Alex grinned. "Those are all excellent questions, and I don't have answers to most of them yet. But I think between your clinical expertise, Dr. Rodriguez's military medical experience, and my background in emergency medical services, we might be able to figure it out. Would you be interested in exploring the possibility?" Sarah thought about Marcus Williams, the 17-year-old motorcycle accident victim whose life she had saved by refusing to follow standard protocol. She thought about the aircraft crash survivors who had lived because she had been willing to perform emergency surgery under impossible conditions. She thought about all the patients she had treated over 15 years, and how many of them might have had better outcomes if someone had been willing to bring advanced medical care to them instead of waiting for them to reach advanced medical care. "Alex, I think that might be the most interesting proposition anyone has made to me in a very long time. Yes, I'm definitely interested in exploring the possibility." By the time Sarah finally arrived back at her apartment that afternoon, her cardboard box of personal belongings from Metropolitan General was still sitting on her kitchen counter exactly where she had left it. But, instead of representing the end of her nursing career, it now seemed like a reminder of how much her life had changed in less than 24 hours. Her phone had been ringing constantly with calls from reporters who wanted to interview her about the aircraft rescue, medical professionals who had heard about her performance and wanted to discuss job opportunities, and friends and family members who had seen the news coverage and wanted to make sure she was okay. Sarah ignored most of the calls and instead sat down at her dining table with her laptop to research everything she could find about wilderness medicine, disaster response training, and the legal requirements for providing emergency medical care in non-hospital settings. As she read through medical journals and government regulations, Sarah began to understand that what she had accomplished the previous night was not just a one-time heroic effort. It was a demonstration of an approach to emergency medicine that could potentially save lives on a regular basis if it was properly developed and implemented. The nurse who had lost her job for insubordination was discovering that insubordination might actually be her greatest professional asset, as long as she could find medical environments that valued independent thinking and clinical expertise over administrative compliance. Her sister Lisa called around dinner time, and Sarah could hear the excitement and pride in her voice even before she spoke. "I saw the news coverage," Lisa said. "They're calling you a hero, Sarah. They're saying you saved more lives in one night than most medical professionals save in their entire careers." Sarah looked out her apartment window at the Seattle skyline, thinking about the aircraft crash survivors who were now recovering in hospitals around the city, thinking about the new career opportunities that had materialized out of nowhere, thinking about the possibility of creating entirely new approaches to emergency medical care. "I don't know about hero," Sarah replied. "But I do know that yesterday I thought my nursing career was over, and today I have more exciting opportunities than I know what to do with. It's funny how things can change so quickly when you're willing to trust your own judgment and take risks for the right reasons." As Sarah hung up the phone and returned to her research, she realized that losing her job at Metropolitan General had been the best thing that could have happened to her career. Not because unemployment was desirable, but because it had forced her out of a comfortable but limiting situation and into circumstances where her real capabilities could be fully utilized. The 3 helicopters that had descended the previous evening, demanding her help, had not just rescued aircraft crash survivors. They had rescued Sarah Chen from a medical career that had been slowly suffocating her potential and delivered her to exactly the kind of meaningful, challenging, and impactful work she had always been meant to do. Looking at the cardboard box on her counter, Sarah decided it was time to unpack those personal belongings. Not because she was returning to her old life, but because she was ready to begin building something entirely new. 3 months after the aircraft rescue, Sarah stood in what used to be an abandoned warehouse in the Georgetown district of Seattle, watching contractors install specialized medical equipment that would transform the space into the headquarters for the Pacific Northwest Emergency Response Medical Team. What had started as a conversation between her, Alex Thompson, and Dr. Rodriguez on a military airbase had become a fully funded nonprofit organization with backing from 3 major hospital systems, the Washington State Department of Emergency Management, and several private foundations. The transformation had happened faster than anyone had expected, driven partly by the media attention from the aircraft rescue, but mostly by the growing recognition among emergency management officials that there was a genuine need for the kind of specialized medical services their team could provide. Sarah walked through the warehouse space, checking on the installation of equipment that most people would never see outside of a hospital emergency room. Advanced trauma care supplies, portable surgical equipment, communication systems that could work in remote areas without cell phone coverage, and specialized vehicles designed to transport medical personnel and equipment to disaster sites quickly and safely. The oxygen concentrators are going in today, and the portable X-ray equipment arrives tomorrow, Alex called out from across the warehouse, where he was coordinating with electricians who were installing the power systems needed to run medical equipment in field conditions. Dr. Rodriguez emerged from what would eventually be the training classroom, carrying blueprints and looking satisfied with the progress. The simulation equipment for field surgery training should be installed by next week. We'll be able to create realistic disaster scenarios for training purposes, which should help us prepare medical personnel for the kind of conditions they might face in real emergency situations. Sarah nodded, still amazed at how quickly their vision had become reality. The Pacific Northwest Emergency Response Medical Team, or NERT as they had started calling it, was designed to fill a gap that the aircraft rescue had revealed clearly. There were situations where people needed advanced medical care immediately, but where traditional emergency medical services couldn't provide that care quickly enough or in the right location. Their team would specialize in rapid deployment to disaster sites, wilderness emergencies, industrial accidents in remote locations, and other situations where the difference between basic first aid and advanced trauma care could mean the difference between life and death for multiple people. Any word on when we'll get final approval from the state medical board? Sarah asked Dr. Rodriguez. Should be within the next 2 weeks. Dr. Harrison and Dr. Kim have been working with the board to establish protocols that will allow us to provide advanced medical care outside of traditional hospital settings while maintaining appropriate oversight and quality standards. The regulatory approval process had been one of the most challenging aspects of creating NERT. Medical care in the United States was heavily regulated, and providing advanced medical services outside of licensed medical facilities required navigating complex legal and administrative requirements. But the success of the aircraft rescue had created enough political support to make the process much smoother than it might otherwise have been. Sarah's phone rang, and she recognized the number as the Washington State Emergency Operations Center. Over the past 3 months, she had been working part-time with the State Emergency Management Team while NERT was being established, providing consultation on medical aspects of disaster planning and response. Sarah, this is Commander Mitchell at the EOC. We've got a situation developing that we think might be appropriate for your team, even though you're not officially operational yet. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergency calls. What kind of situation? Industrial accident at a logging operation about 60 miles northeast of Mount Baker. Explosion and fire, multiple casualties, but the location is remote enough that conventional ambulance transport would take over an hour each way. The Forest Service has cleared a helicopter landing zone, but we need medical personnel who can provide trauma care on site while we organize evacuations. Sarah looked at Alex and Dr. Rodriguez, who had stopped their conversations and were listening to her phone call. This was exactly the kind of emergency that NERT had been designed to handle, but they had planned to spend at least another month in training and equipment testing before their first official deployment. How many casualties are we looking at? Sarah asked. Preliminary reports suggest 8 to 10 injured personnel, with at least 3 who appear to have severe burns and possible blast injuries. The on-site first aid personnel are doing what they can, but they're not equipped to handle trauma of this severity. Sarah made a decision that felt completely natural after 3 months of planning and preparation.
We can be airborne in 30 minutes. How do we coordinate with the on-scene incident commander? I'll patch you directly into their communication network.
And, Sarah? I know you guys aren't officially operational yet, but based on what you accomplished during the aircraft rescue, I have complete confidence that you can handle this. After hanging up, Sarah turned to Alex and Dr. Rodriguez. I know we had planned to wait for final approval and complete all our training protocols, but we have people who need help right now, and we're the best option available.
Dr. Rodriguez smiled.
Sarah, one of the things I learned about you during the aircraft rescue is that you don't wait for perfect conditions to do what needs to be done.
I think we're as ready as we're ever going to be.
Alex was already moving toward the equipment storage area. I'll start loading the medical supplies.
Rodriguez, can you coordinate helicopter transport while Sarah gets the communication equipment set up?
25 minutes later, they were lifting off from Boeing Field in a helicopter operated by a private medical transport company that had contracted with NERT to provide aviation services. Sarah looked down at the Seattle area as they flew north toward the Cascade Mountains, thinking about how different this deployment felt from the chaotic emergency response 3 months ago. This time, they had proper equipment, established protocols, and clear communication with Incident Command. This time, they were flying toward an emergency as a cohesive team rather than as individuals who had been thrown together by circumstances. This time, they knew exactly what they were capable of accomplishing under extreme conditions. The logging operation was located in a remote valley surrounded by steep, forested mountains. As their helicopter approached the landing zone, Sarah could see the aftermath of what had obviously been a significant explosion. Several buildings had been destroyed or severely damaged, emergency vehicles were scattered around the site, and she could see personnel moving with the focused urgency that indicated serious casualties.
The incident commander, a Forest Service supervisor named Jake Morrison, met them at the landing zone and gave them a rapid briefing as they unloaded their equipment.
Explosion occurred about 90 minutes ago when a piece of heavy equipment ruptured a fuel tank near the main processing facility. We've got 10 injured personnel, with 3 who have severe burns and 2 others who may have internal injuries from blast impact. Local EMTs have been providing basic care, but several of the casualties need more advanced treatment than we can provide here. Sarah, Alex, and Dr. Rodriguez moved quickly toward the temporary medical area that had been set up near the incident command post. The scene was more organized than the aircraft crash site had been, but the injuries were similar in their severity and complexity. The first patient was a man in his 40s with third-degree burns over approximately 30% of his body surface area. He was conscious but clearly in severe pain, and the basic burn care that the local EMTs had been able to provide was insufficient for injuries of this magnitude. Sarah immediately began advanced burn care procedures, establishing 4-axis for fluid resuscitation, administering pain medication, and applying specialized burn dressings that would protect the damaged tissue during transport to a burn center. While she worked, Dr. Rodriguez was treating a woman who had suffered internal injuries from blast impact, and Alex was coordinating with the incident commander to organize helicopter evacuations for the most critical patients.
Patient transport ETA is 15 minutes for the first helicopter, Alex reported.
But the burn center is saying they can only take 2 critical patients at a time, which means we're going to need multiple flights.
Sarah looked at her burn patient and made a quick clinical assessment.
He was stable enough for transport, but his condition could deteriorate rapidly without proper care.
This patient needs to be on the first flight. Dr. Rodriguez, what's the status on your patient?
Internal bleeding, but stable for now. She can wait for the second flight as long as we can maintain her blood pressure. For the next 4 hours, Sarah, Alex, and Dr. Rodriguez worked through a series of complex trauma cases under field conditions that tested every aspect of their training and experience. They performed emergency surgery to control bleeding, managed multiple burn patients with varying degrees of injury severity, and coordinated evacuations that required precise timing and communication between multiple agencies. But, unlike the aircraft rescue, where they had been improvising solutions with minimal equipment and support, this time they were operating as part of a well-coordinated emergency response system. Their role was clearly defined, their equipment was specifically designed for the work they were doing, and their communication with other emergency personnel was seamless and efficient. By late afternoon, all 10 casualties had been stabilized and transported to appropriate medical facilities. Sarah was completing paperwork and packing equipment when Jake Morrison approached her with an expression of gratitude and professional respect. "I've been working in emergency management for 20 years, and I've never seen medical care provided in field conditions at the level of what you folks accomplished today. 3 of those patients wouldn't have survived transport to a hospital without the advanced care you provided here." Sarah looked around at the accident site, now largely cleared of emergency personnel, and felt the same sense of professional satisfaction she had experienced after the aircraft rescue. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, the knowledge that what they had accomplished today was not a one-time heroic effort, but a demonstration of a sustainable approach to emergency medicine that could be replicated and improved over time. "Jake, this is exactly the kind of work we designed our team to do. And the more we do it, the better we'll get at it." The helicopter ride back to Seattle gave Sarah time to reflect on how much her life had changed since that rainy Tuesday afternoon when she had walked out of Metropolitan General Hospital with her career in a cardboard box. The nurse who had lost her job for insubordination had become the co-founder of an innovative emergency medical organization that was already saving lives and attracting attention from emergency management professionals around the country. Dr. Rodriguez, sitting across from her in the helicopter, leaned over to speak above the noise of the rotors. "Sarah, I've been thinking about what we accomplished today, and I think we're ready to start discussing expansion. There are other regions that could benefit from the kind of services we're providing, and there are medical professionals in other states who have been asking about training opportunities with our team." Alex nodded enthusiastically. "I've been getting calls from paramedics and nurses all over the West Coast who want to know how they can get involved with what we're doing. I think there's a real demand for this kind of specialized emergency medical service." Sarah looked out the window at the Puget Sound area spread out below them, thinking about the possibilities that Dr. Rodriguez and Alex were describing. NERT had started as a solution to a specific regional need, but it was becoming clear that the need was much broader than they had initially realized. "I think we should focus on getting our operations here fully established before we start thinking about expansion," Sarah replied. "But I also think we should start documenting our procedures and developing training materials that other teams could use to replicate what we're doing in their own regions." By the time they landed at Boeing Field, Sarah was already making mental notes about improvements they could make to their equipment, protocols, and training procedures based on what they had learned during the logging accident response. It was the kind of continuous improvement process that she had always believed was essential to good medical practice, but that had often been difficult to implement in traditional hospital settings where change was slow and bureaucratic. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing the incident reports from the day's emergency response, making notes about what had worked well and what could be improved for future deployments. Her coffee table was covered with medical journals, training manuals, and equipment catalogs as she researched new techniques and technologies that might improve their team's capabilities. The work was challenging and demanding in ways that traditional nursing had never been, requiring not just clinical skills but also logistics coordination, equipment management, and the ability to make critical decisions quickly under extreme pressure. But it was also exactly the kind of meaningful, impactful work that Sarah had always wanted to do. Her phone rang, and she recognized the number as Colonel Martinez from the Washington National Guard. "Sarah, I wanted to give you an update on some developments that might interest you. The Department of Defense has been studying the civilian emergency response model that you and your team have developed, and they're interested in exploring ways to integrate similar capabilities into military disaster response operations." Sarah felt a surge of professional pride. Having their work recognized by military emergency response professionals was validation that they were developing something genuinely innovative and valuable. "What kind of integration are they thinking about?" she asked. "Potentially training military medical personnel in the field surgery and trauma care techniques that you've developed, and possibly creating joint civilian-military response teams for large-scale disasters that exceed the capacity of either military or civilian emergency services alone."
Sarah thought about the implications of what Colonel Martinez was describing.
It represented not just recognition of their work, but the possibility of scaling their impact to handle major disasters and emergencies that affected thousands of people rather than dozens.
"I'd be very interested in exploring that possibility," Sarah replied. "When would they want to begin discussions about implementation?"
"Actually, they'd like to start with having you present your team's approach and results at a National Emergency Management Conference next month in Washington, D.C.
It would be an opportunity to share your innovations with emergency response professionals from around the country."
After hanging up, Sarah looked around her apartment at the evidence of how completely her life had been transformed. Medical journals and training materials had replaced the job search websites she had been studying 4 months ago.
Equipment catalogs and emergency response protocols had replaced the unemployment paperwork that had once covered her dining table.
But, most importantly, the sense of professional frustration and limitation that had characterized her final months at Metropolitan General had been replaced by excitement about possibilities and challenges that she was just beginning to explore. The nurse who had been let go during her final shift had become someone who was helping to define new approaches to emergency medicine. The woman who had been fired for refusing to follow protocol had become someone whose protocols were being studied and adopted by emergency response organizations across the country. Sarah opened her laptop and began preparing the presentation that she would give at the National Emergency Management Conference.
As she worked, she thought about Marcus Williams, the 17-year-old motorcycle accident victim whose life she had saved by trusting her own clinical judgment over established procedures. She wondered if Marcus realized that his case had been the beginning of everything that followed. His recovery had led to her termination, which had led to the aircraft rescue, which had led to NERT, which was now leading to opportunities she had never imagined possible. Sometimes, Sarah realized, losing everything you think you want is the first step toward finding everything you actually need. Sometimes the end of one story is really just the beginning of something much more important.
1 year after walking out of Metropolitan General Hospital with her career in a cardboard box, Sarah Chen stood at a podium in the main auditorium of the Walter E. Washington Convention Center in Washington, D.C., looking out at an audience of nearly 2,000 emergency management professionals from around the world. The banner behind her read International Emergency Medicine Innovation Conference, and her presentation, Field-Based Advanced Trauma Care, Redefining Emergency Medical Response, was the keynote address for the final day of the conference. The past 12 months had passed in a blur of emergency deployments, training seminars, media interviews, and meetings with government officials who wanted to understand how a small team of medical professionals in Seattle had managed to revolutionize emergency medical response in such a short time. NERT had responded to 37 emergency situations, saving more than 200 lives and training over 400 medical professionals in advanced field trauma care techniques. But, perhaps more importantly, their work had inspired the creation of similar teams in 12 other states and 3 foreign countries. The model that had started as a conversation between 3 people on a military airbase was becoming a new standard for emergency medical response worldwide. Sarah began her presentation with a photograph of the aircraft crash site near Mount Rainier, the mountainside clearing where she had performed emergency surgery by flashlight and saved lives that conventional medical wisdom said could not be saved under such conditions. 15 months ago, I was unemployed, Sarah told the audience. I had been fired from my position as a senior trauma nurse for what my hospital administration called insubordination, but what I called prioritizing patient safety over institutional procedure. I thought my career in emergency medicine was over. She clicked to the next slide, which showed the NERT headquarters in Seattle, now a bustling center of activity with a staff of 25 medical professionals and administrative personnel. Today, I'm here to talk about what happens when we stop trying to bring patients to advanced medical care and start bringing advanced medical care to patients. I'm here to talk about what becomes possible when we prioritize clinical expertise and independent judgment over bureaucratic compliance. And I'm here to talk about why losing my job was the best thing that ever happened to my career. The audience laughed, and Sarah could see in their faces the same mixture of professional curiosity and skepticism that she had encountered many times over the past year. Emergency medicine was a conservative field, resistant to change and suspicious of innovations that challenged established practices. But it was also a field filled with people who had chosen their careers because they wanted to save lives, and those people were always willing to listen when someone could demonstrate better ways to accomplish that goal. Sarah spent the next hour walking the audience through the development of NERT, from the aircraft rescue that had demonstrated the need for advanced field medical care, through the regulatory and funding challenges they had overcome to create a sustainable organization, to the training protocols and equipment innovations that had made their success possible. But the heart of her presentation was a detailed analysis of their emergency responses, with specific case studies that demonstrated how advanced field medical care had saved lives that would have been lost under conventional emergency medical protocols. The difference between basic first aid and advanced trauma care is not just a matter of degree, Sarah explained, showing before and after photographs of patients who had received NERT care. It's often a matter of whether people live or die. When someone is bleeding internally in a remote location, the difference between basic wound care and emergency surgery is not academic. It's existential. She told the story of the logging accident, where 3 workers with severe burns had survived because NERT had been able to provide immediate advanced burn care and fluid resuscitation rather than just basic wound treatment. She described the hiking accident in Olympic National Park, where a climber with multiple trauma had lived because they had been able to perform emergency surgery at the base of a cliff rather than attempting to transport him to a hospital with injuries that would have killed him during transport. Each case study was accompanied by detailed medical data showing patient outcomes, response times, and cost-effectiveness analyses that demonstrated not just the clinical value of their approach, but also its economic advantages over conventional emergency medical response. The question we should be asking, Sarah continued, is not whether advanced field medical care is possible. We've proven that it's possible. The question is whether we're willing to change the way we think about emergency medical response in order to save more lives. During the question and answer session that followed her presentation, Sarah fielded inquiries from emergency medical directors, government officials, and medical professionals who wanted to understand how they could implement similar programs in their own regions. The questions were detailed and challenging, covering everything from regulatory compliance to equipment costs to training requirements. But the question that struck Sarah most deeply came from a young nurse in the back of the auditorium who raised her hand hesitantly and asked, "Ms. Chen, how do you know when it's worth risking your career to stand up for what you believe is right?" Sarah looked at the young woman and saw herself 5 years ago, working within a system that often seemed more concerned with administrative